Okay, we are back. Sorry. This steeped all night at 150 degrees. I just turned off the heat. Please focus, would you? Yep. About an hour ago. So it drops its temperature very slowly after that. But as you can see, oh, look at all the pretty little clouds. That enzyme really did its work. Because if I try to bring up a scoop of mash right now, look how thin that is. And look how much overall moisture there is in this now. You know, what looks like water, that's actually just liquefied sugar. There's still a decent amount of water in there, but most of that is sugar. But you'll see that there's no thickness to anything at all. So the next thing that we want to do at this point is, get the actual sugar content. And the way you do that is with a device called, wow, this thing will not focus. Some people use a hydrometer. I can't use a hydrometer in this situation because the bulb will actually touch the mash in the brew pot, so I won't get a true reading. So I use a refractometer. The difference between a hydrometer and a refractometer, well, let me see if I can, I have one here. Now this is what they call a proofing hydrometer because it only reads high alcohol levels. I have a couple other ones that are for reading lower levels, which would be something you would use if you were making beer or wine. But with that thing being that long, if I were to try to put that in the brew pot, I would end up touching the mash and not getting a true reading. So in this case, I use a refractometer. These are only about $15 off of Amazon. While the hydrometer reads in gravity points. Some people, you'll hear them refer to it as specific gravity. This reads in a scale called BRIX, B-R-I-X. It reads strictly sugar levels in foods and liquids. Now, I tried to look through the lens on this earlier with the camera, and it just doesn't work. The phone will not focus through that little lens. But what we do, if I can get this thing to stay still over here, maybe. I just reach into here and grab a small amount of liquid like that. And I spread it over the window. And quickly close that. I'm going to get a reading here. Yep, that's pretty good. It's reading about 8 on the BRIX scale, which is pretty good for not having any additional sugar added to it. If I can make this thing focus on that, maybe. So BRIX. Well, if I was at 8.7, the specific gravity would be 1.035. I like to shoot for 1.090, which would be about 22, 21 and a half. So in that case, I'm at 8. I want to take it up that high. I would probably add about 6 pounds of sugar to this, which I will do here as it cools down, because if I put it in there while this is still hot around 150 degrees, it'll dissolve the sugar for me. So that'll be the next thing I do. But after I add that, I can add the yeast nutrient And I'll use the same amount of yeast nutrient as I used amylase enzyme, 5 tablespoons in there. You can never add too much, and the same goes for yeast. You can never add too much yeast. You can add too little, and then you'll stall out your fermentation, or it just won't ever fully ferment. So, like I said in the other video, some people like to flip me crap and say that, God, I'm wasteful when it comes to this stuff, just overusing things. But, here's the deal. You can't pitch too much. It's just not possible. Better to have too much than not enough. So that's what we have at this point. I'm going to have to let this cool down a little more. Yeah, we're down, just stirring that up, it knocked it down to about 145 degrees. Please focus. Cell phones, I swear. But that's that. I'll add the sugar, and then we'll take another Brix reading after that, and then start the fermentation. See you in a few. Okay, here we go again. I added the sugar to this, and I had to inch it up just slowly to get it up to the 1.090 or 21.5 Brix. You don't want to go too much higher than that, because it'll produce so much alcohol, it'll kill the yeast before it's done fermenting out. So what I ended up adding is basically 1.5 pounds of sugar per gallon of liquid in there. So it would have been 9 pounds. That got it up there. My temperature down here has dropped. There. Dropped to about 115, slightly above that. I checked the temperature on top and it says 114. So it's safe to start adding the yeast nutrient to it. Something I forgot to do earlier, I should have showed you how to do this iodine test. It's not always, well, I'll just say that it's not an absolute necessity. If you know what iodine does in contact with starch, it turns completely black. And then as you add your enzyme to your mash to convert the starch to sugar, when you add the iodine to it, it'll be black for a split second, then it'll dissipate out to the reddish brown color and just turn clear. Some people do that. I did it for a while, but I realized later on that I'm just wasting time. I know if I let this thing simmer all night with the enzyme in there, it'll convert. So here we're going to add about 5 teaspoons of yeast nutrient. I'm only going 5 because even though that scale on the back of the tank might say there's 6.5 gallons of something in here, there's a good portion of that, a gallon or more, is going to be the mash materials. So I'm just adding 1 tablespoon for what I think would be a gallon of liquid. Okay, so there's 5. Just kind of stir this in. That should be good. Now, when it comes to the yeast, there are all different kinds of distilling, fermentation yeasts out there. Some people like to use something called turbo yeast, which is really nothing more than plain old distiller's yeast with the yeast nutrient mixed in. There's nothing special about it. You can do the same thing with Well, if you were to buy these by the pound, like the Red Star Daddy, 1 pound of that to about 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds of yeast nutrient, and that is 100% identical to turbo yeast. But aside from Red Star Daddy, I use Red Star for everything, not because it's a best brand or anything out there. It's just that these guys have been in the business forever of making yeast for fermentation. This is a champagne yeast. This tolerates much higher alcohol levels. I think you could pitch this in something that'll get up to 23, 24% alcohol, and the yeast will still survive. So I'm going to put that in there. And then I'm going to use, God, this stupid thing will not focus for me. See if I can do this one-handed. Really hard to do this shit one-handed. And a tablespoon of Red Star Daddy. That one was a little short. Grab just a little bit more in my spoon. That should even it out. All right. So this, when this starts fermenting, first it'll start bubbling, and then you'll get a cap of, I don't know, it looks like dough in a sense on top. And the more sugar there is in this, the more violent the fermentation will be. Like I said, it could be 70 degrees down here, but once the fermentation's going, you start running your hand up here. I have a laser thermometer. I've checked it against that cloth since you can't read a reflective surface. And it was pretty close to 90 degrees up there. That took about, I don't know, maybe 2 hours. But there's the yeast pitched in there. I'll remove the spoon. It's not necessary to keep that in there anymore. Oops. There we go. And we'll just let this sit. I'll come back in a while to show you the progress of it. Yep, and there goes the noisy furnace. So I'll go ahead and cut this off. I'll be back in a few. Okay, we got one more segment for this video before I stitch everything together and upload it to YouTube. But here we go. There is that so-called, I don't know, I call it a dough layer. It's not really dough. But this is what happens when it starts fermenting. See all that? When you do this, you want to make sure and leave a couple inches of headspace at the top, because as this ferments, the first 2 days or so, this will get really thick. And if you don't have any headspace up here, you'll end up with a huge mess on the floor. This stuff will just bubble over and overflow all over the place. So make sure you leave a couple inches of headspace in there so you don't end up with a huge mess to clean up. You've probably seen other fermentation vessels where people have little airlocks, the little bubbling airlocks on top, and that's really not necessary, because as this ferments, it gives off carbon dioxide, which is heavier than oxygen. So yes, you cannot see the carbon dioxide in there, but that whole top layer, all the way up to here, it's carbon dioxide. So you don't have to worry about, I don't know, funny shit getting in there and killing off your yeast, bacteria and such. If you ever go to an actual distillery, you'll notice that their fermentation vats look like a gigantic oak barrel that's about 6 feet tall and 8 to 10 feet in diameter. They don't have a cap on those either. They just rely on this dough cap to keep things out. So our temperature still hanging about 115 degrees down there. And that's because of this dough cap. It's not letting any heat escape. What else was I going to cover? Oh, in the last video I misspoke when I was putting the yeast nutrient in there. I said 5 teaspoons. I should have said 5 tablespoons. But this is going to go for about a week. Yeah, week to 10 days. Usually they like to tell you that all of your fermentation will be done in the first 72 hours. But I found that's not entirely true, because you'll still have bubbles coming up out of there. Carbon dioxide, which means that the yeast is still converting sugar to alcohol. So I always like to let things sit for at least a week and check to see if I have no more bubbles coming out. But I think that's about it. I can't think of anything else I didn't touch on. But that's how you make a whiskey mash. You let it ferment out, and after that ferments out, I'll create another video showing how I drain this off out of that hose in the bottom into the still, and then we're going to distill it, turn it into moonshine. After that, I'll show you how to process the moonshine in a number of ways. You can either buy bottles of essence. It's a liquid that you add to your moonshine to flavor it like whiskey, or you can do it the traditional way with oak chips. I like to occasionally use a little parlor trick that I learned from clevelandwhiskey.com, where you vacuum seal the moonshine with the oak chips and then release it, and you repeatedly do that. That company can turn out authentic bourbon in gosh, I think they said 3 days rather than 3 years. I've tested it. I like to use the chipped up Jack Daniel's barrels for the oak. Gives it a very distinct taste, but we'll cover all of that later. Anywho, off to the races. I have greenhouse work to do today, so hope this teaches you a little, and we'll touch on the remaining parts in a week or so. Bye.